Let me begin with a simple question. Which sensors have you used today? I ask more precisely, through how many sensing apparatuses has your body, your house, your food, your mobility, your sleep, your health, and perhaps even your mood already passed before arriving here in this room, ready to listen to a lecture on semiotics? The question has a slightly comic side because most of us do not wake up thinking, today I shall enter into relations with a large number of sensors. Yet the first interpreter of my awakening is no longer my consciousness, it is my phone. Or more exactly, that small confederation of sensors, algorithms, screens, and moral insinuations that calls itself with disarming innocence the sleep app in the health shell of the iPhone. Every morning, before I have had the time to decide whether I'm alive in a philosophical sense, my Apple device has already decided how I have slept in a statistical sense. It tells me my time asleep, my sleep duration, sometimes my sleep stages, and with the discreet cruelty of contemporary wellness culture, it transforms the obscure experience of the night into a small administrative report. Technically, of course, the procedure is quite sophisticated. The device does not see my sleep. It infers it. It reads immobility through an accelerometer, correlates it with cardiac rhythms through an optical heart rate sensor, and then lets software classify this data into categories that pretend to be immediately intelligible: awake, REM, core, deep. In other words, my sleep is no longer only an experience, it is a semiotic object reconstructed from traces. Since the birth of our daughter Amalia, this morning report has become, between my wife and myself, the basis of a peculiar domestic competition. The app becomes our domestic referee. It adjudicates fatigue. You see, in former centuries, spouses could say, I did not sleep. Today they can say, look at the graph. And the graph, as we know, has acquired in our civilization a strange sacramental authority. Immediately after sleep comes a weight. The bathroom scale receives me with a silence that is never neutral. It measures pressure, resistance, deformation, depending on its internal technology, and converts the ancient drama of embodiment into a number with one decimal place. Meanwhile, my house has already been sensing me or sensing for me. Its temperature is not simply such, it is a negotiated equilibrium. A set of thermostats, humidity detectors, motion sensors, and air quality monitors keeps the domestic environment in a condition that one is tempted to call homeostasis. The contemporary house increasingly behaves like a second body. It does not think, but it maintains conditions. Then I make coffee. This at least should remain a humanistic ritual, the dark liquid, the morning melancholy, the hope of intellectual or at least cognitive resurrection. But even there, the sensors are waiting. The Nespresso machine knows whether a capsule is inserted, whether water is available, whether pressure and temperature allow extraction, whether a button has been pressed by a sufficiently desperate scholar. Even the toaster, if I use it, participates in this modest cybernetic breakfast. In a very basic toaster, the word sensor may seem exaggerated. One often finds thermal regulation timers, bimetallic elements, circuits that decide when heat has become enough heat. Yet this hesitation is already semiotically interesting. At what point does a mechanism become a sensor? When it detects, when it measures, when it transmits data, when it produces an instruction, when it enters a system in which detection becomes interpretation. The toaster, humble as it is, opens the first philosophical door of this lecture. But the sensor that most impresses me in my house is not in the phone, not in the scale, not in the coffee machine. It is in a Chinese robot vacuum cleaner, Dreamy, which has now acquired an almost intimate knowledge of my apartment. It moves with a certain low circular dignity, as though it were an elderly phenomenologist studying domestic space. Thanks to LIDAR, light detection and ranging, it emits laser pulses, measures the return time, constructs distances, maps walls, furniture, corridors, thresholds. In China, they know my house very well. Now, one might treat all this as anecdotal, a charming prelude perhaps to a more serious discussion, but I would suggest the opposite. The anecdote is already the theory in miniature. Our lives are increasingly organized by devices that sense before we interpret, that measure before we narrate, that classify before we understand. Sensors clean our floors, prepare our coffee, regulate our rooms, guide our cars, count our steps, monitor our sleep, estimate our fatigue, alert us to possible anomalies, and invite us, sometimes gently, sometimes tyrannically, to become managers of ourselves. The contemporary car alone contains hundreds of sensors: pressure, proximity, acceleration, braking, lane position, blind spots, tire conditions, engine performance. It is not merely a vehicle, it is a mobile semiotic laboratory. Yet the most consequential expansion of sensors is perhaps not in the domain of comfort, mobility, or efficiency, it is in the domain of health. Sensors are increasingly placed at the threshold between body and medicine. Sensors do not simply give us reality, they transform contact with reality into a chain of inscriptions. They select, filter, format, and often pre-interpret it. This lecture then is a first exploration of what I would like to call a semiotics of sensors. Its aim is not to denounce sensors, nor to celebrate them with the usual technological enthusiasm. It is rather to ask what happens to science when sensing is delegated to technical systems. The question is particularly urgent in contemporary medicine, for medicine has always been semiotic, long before artificial intelligence, long before computer vision, long before wearable devices and digital biomarkers. The physician was trained to read the body, the complexion, the tremor, the gait, the voice, the pulse, the face. Clinical knowledge was a discipline of science. But today, the body increasingly reaches the clinician through sensors. The face becomes a set of landmarks, movements, asymmetries, microexpressions, quantified trajectories. The pulse becomes a curve. Sleep, as I said, becomes stages. Blood pressure is turned into a dashboard. And the patient becomes in part a data environment. The central issue is not whether this is good or bad. That would be too easy and perhaps too moralistic. The issue is how meaning is reorganized when sensing, measuring, classifying, and interpreting are distributed across bodies, devices, algorithms, and institutions. A sensor can detect what the eye misses, but it can also miss what only a relation can perceive. An algorithm can identify regularities, but diagnosis is not only regularity recognition, it is also contextual judgment, it is narrative reconstruction, ethical responsibility, and attention to singularity. This is why a semiotics of sensors is necessary, not because semiotics should nostalgically defend the old world against the new one, but because it can describe with conceptual precision the passages through which the sensible becomes signal, and then data, and then evidence, and then finally decision. So at this point, one might think that we're dealing with a very recent story, a story of wearables, domestic robots, smart scales, digital biomarkers, optical sensors, LIDAR, pressure monitors, and algorithmic dashboards. And yet, if we look more carefully, the sensor is new, the gesture is ancient. Medicine begins when sensation becomes method. The physician's hand, ear, eye, and memory become devices for detecting differences. The body speaks, but it does not speak in propositions. It speaks in heat, in rhythm, in pallor, in tremor, in swelling, also in silence. So the physician must translate. This is why the history of the pulse is so important for a semiotics of sensors. The pulse is one of the most elementary and most extraordinary signs in medicine. It is almost nothing, a small rhythmic pressure under the fingers, and yet for millennia it was the privileged window into the invisible life of the heart. Before electrocardiograms, before sphygmomanometers, before pulse oximeters, before smartwatches, there was the wrist. The story begins, as good stories often do in Mesopotamia, with grief. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh laments, "I touch his heart, but it does not beat at all." Egyptian medicine went farther. The ancient Egyptians understood that the heart was connected to vessels extending throughout the body, and they formulated one of the most beautiful sentences in the history of medical semiotics. The heart speaks out of every limb. Chinese medicine developed pulse diagnosis into a refined art. The physician did not merely ask whether the pulse was present or absent, rapid or slow. The pulse became a complex landscape of qualities, positions, depths, tensions, seasonal variations, bodily correspondences. Traditional accounts distinguish numerous pulse types, each connected to a configuration of bodily imbalance. Indian Ayurveda too integrated pulse examination within a broader understanding of balance among body, mind, and spirit. But the Greek case is especially intriguing because it shows the exact moment when pulse taking begins to move from sensation toward theory and from touch toward measurement. Hippocrates and the Hippocratic corpus mention arterial pulsation in several conditions, but it was Praxagoras of Kos, born around 340 BCE and belonging to the medical school of Kos, who first gave the arterial pulse a central place in diagnosis. He distinguished arteries from veins and understood that pulsation belonged to the arteries. Then came Alexandria, which is perhaps one of the most fascinating scenes in the history of medical sensing. In the 3rd century BCE, under the intellectual atmosphere of the great library and museum, physicians such as Herophilus and Erasistratus attempted to transform medicine into a science of observable structures, measurable rhythms, bodily functions. Herophilus, born in Chalcedon in Asia Minor, and often called the father of anatomy, treated the pulse not as a vague sign of vitality, but as a measurable rhythm. He compared it to music. But Herophilus did something even more important for our story. He reportedly used a portable water clock a clepsydra to count the pulse. Here the physician's fingers meet an external instrument. Erasistratus, Herophilus' contemporary, adds an even more intriguing chapter to the story. He tried to understand the relation between the heart and the arteries, noting that arterial movement followed cardiac contraction. He came remarkably close to physiological insight, even though he still remained within the Greek theory of pneuma, the vital breath of air thought to circulate through the arteries. And then comes the episode that gives this genealogy its almost theatrical brilliance. According to Plutarch, Erasistratus was called to examine Antiochus, son of Seleucus I, who was wasting away from a mysterious illness. The young prince was not suffering, however, from an ordinary bodily disease. He was in love, impossibly and silently, with Stratonice, his stepmother. The body knew what the mouth could not say. Erasistratus discovered the hidden passion by observing Antiochus' bodily reactions when Stratonice entered the room. His pulse accelerated, his color changed, his physiological rhythm betrayed his secret. From a semiotic point of view, the episode is extraordinary because it shows that measurement does not simply produce objectivity, it also produces suspicion. Once the body can be measured, it can be interrogated. Here we see in embryonic form a long history that will eventually lead to the modern lie detector. The first polygraph would only appear in the 19th century, and its 20th century refinements would combine respiration, pulse, blood pressure, and galvanic skin response. Yet the underlying logic is already present in the ancient anecdote. An inner state, especially one that is concealed, is presumed to betray itself through involuntary bodily variations. The body is measured because it is thought to be less capable of lying than speech. This logic will later extend beyond the pulse. The human face, too, would become an object of comparison, typification, and suspicion. Ancient physiognomy was not yet measurement in the strict modern sense, yet it already rested on the idea that faces are not entirely singular. They can be divided into parts, compared in their proportions, associated with recurrent morphologies, gathered into types. A lion-like face could be read as a sign of courage. An animal resemblance became a moral diagnosis. This genealogy allows us to return to our initial question with greater precision. What then is new about sensors in medicine? It is not new that medicine senses. Medicine has always sensed. It is not new that medicine translates bodily phenomena into science. It has always done so. It is not even new that medicine counts, measures, and discretizes. Egyptian water clocks and Alexandrian clepsydras already shows us that the numerical translation of bodily rhythm is not a modern obsession, but one of medicine's founding gestures. What is new is that sensing is increasingly delegated to autonomous technical systems. The hand withdraws, the device remains. So if the pulse was the first great diagnostic rhythm, the face may be the first great diagnostic surface. This is not, of course, a new intuition. Physicians have always looked at faces. They've looked for pallor, jaundice, asymmetry, paralysis, edema, emaciation, fatigue, pain, fear, confusion, agitation. In contemporary medicine, the face is becoming a sensorized surface. A face-based diagnostic system usually begins with image or video acquisition. A photograph, a smartphone camera, a webcam, a clinical video, sometimes a 3D scan. Then comes face detection and alignment. The system identifies the face, normalizes pose and illumination, locates landmarks around the eyes, nose, mouth, jawline, and brows, and extracts either handcrafted features, distances, angles, asymmetries, wrinkles, textures, color distributions, or deep features learned by convolutional neural networks, vision transformers, graph neural networks, or multimodal architectures. One of the most striking recent examples is Face Age, a deep learning system developed to estimate biological age from facial photographs and improve prognostication in cancer. Published in The Lancet Digital Health in 2025, the study trained and validated a model that translates facial appearance into an estimated biological age. In cancer cohorts, the facially inferred age was associated with survival, and the authors argued that such models could improve prognostic assessment while requiring further validation. A 2026 continuation published in Nature Communications goes further. It uses serial clinical photographs to calculate a face aging rate, measuring change in face age over time in more than 2,000 cancer patients receiving radiation therapy. Higher facial aging rate was associated with decreased survival probability. The face is not only read as expression, it is read as temporality. It becomes a clock, but not the neutral clock of chronology. It becomes a biological clock and a prognostic clock, a clock of vulnerability. A second domain is rare genetic disease. This morphology has long depended on the trained clinical eye, the ability to recognize facial gestalt. Recent systems such as Gestalt Matcher and multimodal successors attempt to computationalize this clinical intuition. A 2024 Nature Genetics study on next-generation phenotyping in a national diagnostic setting showed that computer-assisted facial image analysis with Gestalt Matcher could help prioritize diagnosis for ultra-rare diseases when integrated with sequencing and clinical phenotyping. The algorithm does not recognize a syndrome as a clinician does. It maps a face into a latent space where a proximity becomes diagnostic suggestion. The child's face is compared not with an abstract norm, but with thousands of other faces, syndromes, annotations, and genetic labels. A third domain is neurology, and especially Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's is not only tremor, it is also masked face and reduced facial expressivity. Recent reviews emphasize that AI-assisted diagnosis increasingly uses motor symptom markers, including eye movements and facial expressions, alongside speech, handwriting, finger tapping, and gait. This matters deeply for semiotics. A masked face in Parkinson's is not only a neurological sign, it is also a social sign. It changes how others interpret the patient's attention, warmth, emotion, and intentionality. The sensor may detect a reduction in facial movement. The patient leaves the social consequences of being misread. A fourth domain is pain. Are you in pain? Is anybody in pain? I'm a little bit in pain now, but it will be very difficult to demonstrate to you that I'm in pain. This is a very difficult problem for medicine. But also for philosophy, pain is perhaps the most philosophically difficult medical sign because it is radically first person and yet constantly requires public interpretation. I can say that I'm in pain, but the clinician, the nurse, the caregiver, and the institution must somehow assess it. This is especially urgent in infants, nonverbal patients, patients with cognitive impairment, postoperative patients, and people who cannot reliably communicate. Recent work on automatic pain assessment uses facial expression recognition, machine learning, and deep learning to detect and quantify pain-related facial cues. A 2024 review surveys spatial facial expression and machine learning approaches to automatic pain assessment, while a 2025 systematic review concludes that AI-based facial expression recognition is promising, especially in controlled settings, but still limited by small samples, heterogeneous methods, and insufficient external validation. China, which is a country where I also teach and do research, is doing enormous progresses in this field exactly because the samples they can use in their medical laboratories are enormous. Recently, I asked a colleague of mine the number of patients that were examined for a scientific paper that he had written, and he replied 40,000. A 2025 scientific reports study developed an automated system to assess pain intensity in adult patients from changes in facial expression. Technically, these systems often analyze brow lowering, eyelid tightening, nose wrinkling, upper lip raising, mouth opening, cheek raising, and other facial action units associated with pain. The face is parsed into muscular events, and suffering becomes a pattern of deformation. And yet again, we must be careful. A system may detect facial correlates of pain, but pain is not reducible to facial expression. Some patients mask pain. Some cultures inhibit its display. Some conditions alter expressivity. Some faces are less legible to algorithms because datasets are biased. Then a fifth domain is Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. In 2024, a scientific reports study proposed the digital detection of Alzheimer's disease using smiles and conversations with a chatbot, combining facial and speech features for accessible screening. In 2025, another study on AI-based facial emotion analysis reported cross-validation accuracies for distinguishing mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and healthy controls, including an accuracy of 75.4% for distinguishing Alzheimer's disease from other etiologies among cognitively impaired individuals. A sixth domain is psychiatry, perhaps the most delicate one. A 2025 systematic review in BMC Psychiatry examined AI-based recognition of facial and microexpressions for diagnosing mental and neurological disorders. After screening 1710 articles, it selected 36 studies, mainly focused on autism, depression, and anxiety, and concluded that facial and multimodal data combined with advanced algorithms are increasingly used for diagnosis. Another 2025 study, Emoface, published in Mental Health Research, proposed an AI-assisted model to differentiate major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder through facial biomarkers using videos from 353 participants exposed to emotional stimuli and generating 3D digital faces to emphasize diagnostic facial patterns. In autism research too, current work explores whether naturalistic facial dynamics can help quantify atypical expression patterns. A 2026 digital medicine study analyzed naturalistic video recordings to quantify facial expression patterns in autism during spontaneous unscripted interactions. Therefore, the question is not whether artificial intelligence can extract clinically useful signals from the face. It clearly can, and in some domains it is already doing so with remarkable sophistication. The real question is what kind of sign the face becomes when it is processed by sensors and algorithms. The new diagnostic phase is therefore a contested semiotic object. On one side, it promises an unprecedented refinement of medical perception, more sensitivity and more quantification. On the other side, it threatens to naturalize interpretation and to disguise probabilistic inference as visual evidence, as well as to turn the person's most socially exposed surface into a permanent diagnostic document. We are not facing a simple choice between technophilia and technophobia. The same refinement that makes AI medically powerful also makes it politically sensitive. A system, for instance, that separates speech from noise can support hearing aids, telemedicine, and voice-based diagnosis. If you are with a hearing impairment, or if you know someone, your parents, your grandparents, who have an hearing impairment, you know that being in crowds or even be in a social dinner with many people can be excruciating because the voices become extremely blurred in perception. And so through AI, now we are able more and more to redefine and separate multiple voices for those who wear hearing aids. So on the one hand, for instance, a system that separates speech from noise can support hearing aids, telemedicine, and voice-based diagnosis. But it can also recover voices that were not meant to be heard. Diagnostic AI does not merely extend medicine, it extends detectability. But the same technical refinement has another phase. If AI learns to isolate the voice from noise, it can also recover a voice that someone tried to hide. If it learns to reconstruct missing syllables, it can also reconstruct speech from a degraded or abstracted recording. If it learns to distinguish signal from interference in order to assist the hard of hearing, it can also defeat the acoustic countermeasures of those who do not wish to be heard. If it learns to read lips, vibrations, prosody, hesitation, tremor, breath, and silence, then it does not listen only to symptoms of disease. It begins to listen to symptoms of life. That is the crucial passage. Diagnostic AI does not merely extend medicine. As I said, it extends detectability. And detectability is never innocent. The old clinical scene was based on a certain asymmetry, but also on a certain pact. The patient entered the space of medicine and consented, at least ideally, to be examined. The physician listened, touched, observed, asked, interpreted. The patient could speak, could withhold, hesitate, narrate, contradict. The diagnostic relation was not free from power, of course, but it was still a relation. The sensorized world changes this scene. The danger is not only that we shall be recorded, that is already banal. The more profound danger is that we shall be interpreted without knowing it. A voice captured by a microphone may reveal more than words: fatigue, agitation, cognitive slowing, intoxication, illness, fear, desire, social background, accent, age, emotional instability. A face captured by a camera may reveal more than identity: biological age, pain, neurological impairment, affective state, genetic morphology, attention, embarrassment, hesitation. A body captured by wearables may reveal more than movement: insomnia, pregnancy, relapse, addiction, anxiety, decline, even solitude. The contemporary sensor does not simply collect data, it multiplies involuntary signs. And this is why semiotics is essential. Semiotics does not need to point an accusatory finger at artificial intelligence. It does not need to say simplistically, here's technology, therefore here is domination. Its task is cellular. it shows that every technical system of detection is also a system of signification. It asks what is being selected as a sign, what is being treated as noise, what is being transformed into evidence, what interpretive frame makes a signal meaningful, and what institutions are authorized to act upon that meaning. In other words, semiotics reveals the continuity between diagnosis and surveillance. This continuity does not mean that medicine and espionage are the same. They are not. There are purposes, there are forms of accountability, norms, and ethical horizons that differ radically. But they often rely on homologous technical operations: capture, isolation, enhancement, pattern recognition, anomaly detection, classification, prediction. The same algorithmic ear that helps a hearing aid suppress background noise may also have a hidden recorder recover speech from a difficult environment. The same facial analysis model that supports neurological diagnosis may also enable behavioral profiling. The same wearable that monitors health may also become an archive of intimacy. The issue then is not the sensor in itself. It is the trajectory of interpretation that follows senses. Sensing. Who senses, for what purpose, under whose authority, with what consent, with what possibility of refusal, with what right to opacity, with what standards of validation, with what safeguards against bias, with what limits on secondary use, with what distinction between clinical care, commercial optimization, workplace monitoring, insurance evaluation, policing, and intelligence. So governance, to conclude, must begin here. A healthy technological advancement is certainly possible. Indeed, it is necessary. We should want better hearing aids, better diagnostic tools, better remote screening, better support for fragile patients, better ways to detect pain in those who cannot speak, better ways to recognize neurodegenerative disease before irreversible damage has occurred. To refuse these possibilities would be ethically irresponsible. But it would be equally irresponsible to ignore their pernicious counterparts: ambient surveillance, acoustic extraction, emotional profiling, physiological suspicion, predictive discrimination, and the progressive erosion of the right not to be interpreted. Perhaps this is the deepest transformation introduced by sensors and AI. Modernity was often concerned with the right to speak. The sensorized age will also have to defend the right not to be constantly decoded. The ancient physician placed fingers on the wrist and counted a pulse. The gesture was intimate, localized, temporary. Today, sensors count everywhere. They listen everywhere. They look everywhere. They infer everywhere. The body has not ceased to be semiotic. It has become hyper-semiotic. Its smallest variations are increasingly available for capture, calculation, and consequence. The task of semiotics in this new diagnostic ecology is not to slow down knowledge. It is to prevent knowledge from becoming blind to its own conditions of production. It is to remind medicine that a signal is not yet a symptom, that a symptom is not yet a diagnosis, that the diagnosis is not yet a person, and that a person is never reducible to the measurable regularities of a body. The future of medical AI will depend not only on better models and more sensitive devices, but on our capacity to govern the passage from sensing to meaning. That is where semiotics must stand. Grazie.